Welcome to the Nullification Crisis. Who has the power? In this interactive lesson, you will explore one of the earliest constitutional crises in American history. You will analyze the debate over states' rights versus federal authority and evaluate how President Andrew Jackson responded to the Nullification Crisis of 1832. It's 1832. Congress has passed a new tariff, a tax on imported goods. Northern factory owners supported it because it protected American industry, but Southern farmers were outraged. South Carolina, in particular, called it the Tariff of Abominations. This moment sets the stage for a showdown between state and federal power. As you explore, they will consider our essential question: who truly holds the power in our government, the states or the nation as a whole? Begin by playing the intro video. As you watch, remember to complete the guiding questions in your graphic organizer under Part 1, Setting the Stage. Please focus on the causes of the Tariff of Abominations, the conflict between the North and South, and the meaning of the word nullify.
All right, let's dive into a massive constitutional showdown from early American history.
And this very question, it pushed the U.S. right to the brink of civil war. The idea was simple: protect America's new industries from foreign competition. But this tariff split the country right down the middle, creating clear winners and losers.
For Southern states, which relied heavily on trade, this law felt totally unfair. They argued the tariff was unconstitutional and, because of that, just plain invalid.
This idea, known as nullification, was a huge challenge to federal power. And so this set the stage for a major battle over the nation's future. You've got two totally opposing views here. A real clash of ideals, you know? And this is when the conflict went from just a debate to a direct confrontation.
You can see how fast this all escalated. The country was getting really close to war.
For the president, this was about one thing: the survival of the United States.
That's when Senator Henry Clay, the great compromiser, stepped in to cool things down.
This shows how a compromise came together right at the last minute, pulling everyone back.
So while both sides claimed victory, the root of the problem, it was far from settled.
Because really, this compromise was just a band-aid, not a permanent solution.
And this exact same debate would eventually explode again, leading right up to the Civil War. And Jackson's famous toast? It became a rallying cry for national unity above everything else.
This whole crisis really gets at a core question we're still asking in America today.
In this short interactive video, you'll step into the shoes of a South Carolina lawmaker during the Nullification Crisis of 1832. You'll make decisions, answer questions, and see how President Andrew Jackson responded when a state challenged federal law. Watch carefully and think, who really has the power, the state or the federal government? Before the crisis erupted, thinkers like Thomas Jefferson and John C. Calhoun shaped the idea of nullification, the belief that states could reject federal laws they deemed unconstitutional. Jefferson had planted this seed in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, while Calhoun expanded it, claiming the Constitution was a compact between the states. This idea directly challenged the Constitution's Supremacy Clause. Watch the next video and fill in your notes organizer.
So, what happens when a state just decides to say no to a federal law? It's a question, an idea, that nearly tore America apart decades before the Civil War ever started. And at the center of it all were two of the nation's biggest names, Thomas Jefferson and John C. Calhoun. In this explainer, we're going to break down the whole thing, the nullification crisis. Right, let's just start with the central question, because this is what it all boils down to. It seems so simple, right? But this one question has the power to literally unravel a country. The idea that one state can just turn around and say, nope, not doing it to the federal government, I mean, where does that even lead? Yeah, it might sound straightforward, but this question turned out to be one of the most dangerous ever asked in the whole American experiment. Trying to answer it pushed the young republic right to the absolute brink. And at the heart of this huge ideological battle, you've got these two giants of American politics. First, there's Thomas Jefferson, the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was deeply suspicious of a powerful central government. And then you have John C. Calhoun, a brilliant, intense defender of the South. Their totally opposing views really set the stage for a massive constitutional crisis. Okay, so to really get this, we've got to start with Jefferson. You see, he wasn't trying to break the country apart, not at all. He was actually trying to protect it, with an idea that he saw as a kind of defensive shield. And that shield was the doctrine of states' rights. For Jefferson, the states weren't just lines on a map. No, they were the essential guardians against a federal government that could become a tyranny. You can think of them as the last line of defense for the people's liberty. And look, for Jefferson, this wasn't just some abstract theory he cooked up. It was born in the fire of a real crisis, the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. These were actual laws that made it a crime to criticize the government. To Jefferson, this was exactly the kind of tyranny the American Revolution was fought to stop, and he knew it demanded a really powerful response. And this quote right here, man, it gets to the absolute core of his argument. He's not just saying these laws are a bad idea. He's saying they're totally illegitimate, void, and of no force. From his point of view, when the federal government oversteps its bounds, the states don't just have a right to complain, they have a duty to sound the alarm. All right, now let's jump forward a few decades and bring John C. Calhoun into the picture, because this is where things get really interesting. Calhoun takes Jefferson's idea, but he doesn't use it as a shield. Oh no, he sharpens it into a sword. He called it nullification. And you have to see what a huge leap this is. Jefferson's idea was about the states acting together to protest. Calhoun's theory is something else entirely. He's arguing that a single state could act as its own judge, jury, and executioner for a federal law. It's like giving one state a constitutional eject button it can press all by itself. And let's be clear, Calhoun designed this weapon for a very specific purpose. He was terrified that the industrial North, with its growing population and power in Congress, would pass laws that would destroy the agricultural slave-based economy of the South. So nullification was his ultimate tool to protect the interests of a regional minority. So let's just boil it down right here. Jefferson's shield is like a fire alarm. It's a collective warning from all the states that the federal government is out of line. But Calhoun's sword is an eject button, a veto that a single state can use to kill a law just for itself. That jump from a collective check to an individual veto, well, that's a massive, radical change. And this radical idea didn't just stay in books and speeches for long. In the early 1830s, Calhoun's sword was actually drawn, and it pushed the United States to the very, very edge of a civil war. So what was the spark that lit this whole powder keg? Well, it was a federal tax, a tariff, passed back in 1828. Now, the manufacturers up in the North, they loved it. It protected them from cheap foreign competition. But the South, which had to import a lot of its goods, absolutely hated it. They gave it a nickname, the Tariff of Abominations. And from there, things just escalated fast. By 1832, South Carolina, running with Calhoun's ideas, officially nullified the tariff. They basically said, this law is dead in our state. They even threatened to leave the Union if President Andrew Jackson tried to make them pay. And Jackson, who was not a man to be trifled with, threatened to send the army down. For a really tense moment, it looked like civil war was about to break out right then and there, before a last-minute compromise in 1833 managed to cool things down for a little while. This quote from Calhoun is just so revealing, isn't it? He frames his radical idea not as an attack on the country, but as the only way to save it. But the key here is to understand what he meant by liberty. For Calhoun and his supporters, that liberty was inseparable from the freedom to own slaves and expand that institution, all protected by this ultimate state-level veto power. But that compromise in 1833, it was really just a truce. It wasn't a solution. It was more like a ceasefire that patched things up for the time being, but it left the huge, fundamental question just hanging there, totally unanswered. Who actually has the final say? The federal government or the states? So the immediate crisis might have passed, but the legacy, the idea of a state being able to just say no, well, that would cast a long and very dark shadow over the nation's future. And here's the absolute critical takeaway. Calhoun's theory of nullification, it basically provided the legal and philosophical blueprint for secession. Think about it. If a state can nullify one federal law, why not all of them? And if it can do that, why can't it just nullify the Union itself? That's the question that was left hanging in 1833, and it would ultimately be answered in blood, starting in 1861. And don't for a second think this is just some dusty old history. I mean, every time you hear a debate today about a state defying federal healthcare rules, or challenging environmental regulations, or arguing over immigration policy, you are hearing the echo of Calhoun versus Jefferson. That fundamental tension, who gets the final say, it's still one of the most powerful forces in American politics. So yeah, while the nullification crisis itself did end, the debate it started never really did. That core question of whether a state can just say no, a question first framed by Jefferson's shield and then sharpened by Calhoun's sword, is one America is, in many ways, still trying to answer today. Thanks for watching.
Imagine you are a South Carolina legislator during the nullification crisis. 3 ideas are presented to you on how to approach this issue: support, oppose, or find a compromise. Explore the options in the next slides to determine what you would decide to do. Make sure to fill out your organizer as you progress through the videos. In the first scenario, you will see South Carolina's decision to support nullification. The state legislature declared that the federal tariff was unconstitutional and therefore void within its borders. President Jackson viewed this act as treason, a direct challenge to the union's authority. After the video, guide discussion using this question: do you agree that a state should have the power to ignore a federal law if it believes the law is unconstitutional? Why or why not? Please consider the potential consequences for unity, law enforcement, and national stability.
Today we're diving into a radical idea that almost tore America apart: the nullification crisis.
Believe it or not, back in the 1830s, this question pushed the U.S. to the very brink of war.
It all kicks off with a tax from 1828, a tax so hated they called it an abomination.
The North loved it. It protected their factories. But the agricultural South, it was crushing their economy.
Southern leaders felt this was a massive, unconstitutional overreach by the federal government.
So in response, this wild idea starts bubbling up. What if a state could just veto a federal law?
This idea had a name: nullification. So how is this thing supposed to work anyway?
Well, they had a 3-step plan for a state to basically just say no to a federal law.
This whole thing was based on something called the compact theory of the United States.
Basically, since the states created the federal government, they should have the final say on its power.
And the main guy pushing this idea? None other than the Vice President himself, John C. Calhoun.
This quote from him says it all. For Calhoun, liberty, meaning states' rights, came first. He even wrote out the whole argument for it, but get this, he published it anonymously at first.
Okay, so this wasn't just talk. South Carolina decided to actually do it, to put it into action.
And things escalated fast, leading right to the threat of military action from the president.
So you had South Carolina standing alone, staring down the president and the entire federal government.
War was avoided, but just barely. A last-minute compromise cooled things down, for now.
So, nullification was defeated, at least for the moment. But the idea itself, it didn't go away.
In fact, this same argument would become a cornerstone for secession just 30 years later.
This whole crisis forces a huge question. Who gets the final say, the states or the federal government?
And that question, about the ultimate limits of power, is something we're still debating today.
In the second scenario, students explore Jackson's response to South Carolina's defiance. Jackson believed that preserving the Union was the president's highest duty. He warned that disunion by armed force was treason and asked Congress for authority to enforce federal law by any means necessary. Was Jackson's use of presidential power justified to preserve the Union, or did it give the executive branch too much authority? As you watch the next video, think about the balance between leadership and overreach.
All right, let's talk about a time the United States almost completely fell apart. So, can a single state just decide to ignore the entire nation? That was the big question. It all started with a tax, a federal tariff designed to protect industries in the North. And the South? They absolutely hated it. They felt it punished their economy just to help the North. So South Carolina pushed back with a really radical idea, one that came from the top. They called it nullification. The basic idea? A state can just cancel a federal law it doesn't like. And the main guy behind this idea? Yep, the Vice President himself, John C. Calhoun. His whole argument was that since states created the federal government, they should have the final say. So in 1832, South Carolina went for it. They officially nullified the tariff, starting a huge showdown. President Andrew Jackson's reaction was fast and tough. For him, this was about saving the country. Jackson's view was clear. The Union was forever, and federal law was the top dog, period. And he did not mince words. He basically called any attempt to break up the country treason. Jackson even threatened to send in federal troops. The country was holding its breath. Okay, so with everything about to boil over, Congress came up with a two-part solution. It was your classic carrot and stick move, something for everyone to try and fix the standoff. So the force bill was the stick, and the compromise tariff was the carrot. It worked. South Carolina took the deal and repealed its nullification. For the moment, the crisis was over. But here's the thing. Even though the crisis ended, the real problem didn't just vanish. That core debate about states' rights versus federal power, that wasn't going away anytime soon. And you can see here, this crisis was really just a preview of the Civil War. So, what's the big takeaway? Well, it set the stage for federal power over the states. But it left behind this one giant question that we are still trying to answer today. Just what is the right balance between state and federal power? It's a question that still defines us. All right, let's talk about a time
The third
United
scenario
States
presents
almost
Henry Clay's
completely fell
compromise solution. Clay proposed gradually lowering tariffs to ease tensions between North and South. South Carolina accepted this compromise and repealed its Nullification Act, avoiding armed conflict, at least for the moment. Analyze, was this a lasting solution, or did it simply delay a larger conflict? While compromise brought peace in 1833, the issue of states' rights continued to divide the nation and would resurface before the Civil War.
Let's talk about a crisis that almost started a civil war 30 years early.
So how did a simple tax push the U.S. to the absolute brink? Let's get into it. It all started with this tax. Southerners felt it was totally unfair, so they gave it a nickname.
And things escalated fast. In just a few years, a tax dispute became a major national crisis.
South Carolina basically said, nope, we're not paying. They claimed the right to just ignore federal law. This was a huge deal. A single state was staring down the entire U.S. government. So the whole thing became a clash of titans. Three powerful men with very different ideas.
President Andrew Jackson, he was furious. He called it treason and swore he wouldn't let the country split.
On the other side was John C. Calhoun. For him, it was all about states' rights.
So you have these two sides completely dug in. Was there any way out of this mess?
And this is where our third titan steps in, Senator Henry Clay, the great compromiser. See, Clay's whole philosophy was that you had to find a middle ground. He wanted a solution, not a fight.
And this was his specialty. The guy was a master negotiator, totally dedicated to keeping the Union together.
But his task was tough. He needed a deal where both Jackson and South Carolina could claim a win. And what he came up with was brilliant. A clever two-part solution to the whole problem.
It was basically a carrot and stick approach. One part was tough, the other was a peace offering.
This plan was perfect. It let both sides back down gracefully without looking like they'd lost. And you know what? It actually worked. The Union was saved, war was avoided, everyone won, kinda.
But here's the real question. Was the crisis actually over for good?
For the moment, absolutely. It was a huge success. They had pulled the country back from the brink. But that core question, states' rights versus federal power, it never really went away. It was just paused.
Which leaves us wondering, did they solve the crisis or just postpone the inevitable?
Once all three perspectives have been viewed, you will compare the options side by side. Think about motivations, consequences, and underlying values. After you have thought through these ideas, determine which approach, supporting nullification, opposing it, or seeking compromise, best balances the rights of states with the needs of the nation. Be sure to back up your answers with evidence from the videos. The nullification crisis tested the strength of the Constitution and the presidency. As you move through this unit, keep asking, who truly holds the power in our government, the states or the nation as a whole? Now let's move into your independent assignment. Create a short visual summary or political cartoon illustrating the tension between state and federal power. Label key figures, Jackson, Calhoun, Clay, and include a quote that captures each viewpoint. To view your assignment and rubric, access your Google Classroom to view today's post.